Hi, I'm Karl Konrad and welcome to the weekend edition of Australian Immigration News, proudly brought to you by Australian Immigration Law Services, the company I founded right here in Sydney more than 25 years ago. You know what? I can't remember such a crazy week in the world of Australian immigration. If the government thought that by silently releasing the news about capping student numbers last Friday night might go unnoticed by the usual media cycle, they planned that very poorly. By Monday morning, the university leaders were in a crisis meeting with the Education Minister Jason Clare, the Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neill, and the Immigration Minister Andrew Giles. The universities were desperately looking for an outcome that would not lead to their financial demise. For the first time in a long time, they were at loggerheads with the government, a far cry from the Education Minister's glowing report just a little while ago.
And that is a terrific example of the two major political parties working together. It's also a great example of universities and government working together, and universities and business. You can't get enough of that.
Sad to see those days are in the rearview mirror. In a very rare occurrence, probably not in living memory, the Vice-Chancellors from the University of Sydney and Melbourne took to the media to voice their displeasure. First was Professor Mark Scott from the University of Sydney, straight after the crisis meeting on Monday afternoon. Here he is on ABC's Radio National Drive program.
We want the government to have a detailed understanding of how this market works. Students who are thinking of coming to the University of Sydney or the University of Melbourne or UNSW, they are looking at our counterparts around the world who are also, like us, ranked in the top 20 globally. It's not simply a case that you can stop students going to the University of Melbourne and they will happily go to another university somewhere else in the country. We are working in a global market. We have global competitors.
Then on the morning of the following day was Michael Wesley from the University of Melbourne.
Can I also raise, Fran, an anomaly in how the government is doing the counting? I think it's really quite odd that international student numbers are included in Australia's migration numbers when we know that around 80% of all international students actually leave Australia after finishing their studies. So I think it's a little bit dangerous for us to kind of lump international students in with all of our migration numbers related to the housing crisis and then think that simply pulling on the international student number lever is going to get us out of this problem. I think it needs a holistic solution.
Less than 12 months ago, the Education Minister and 11 university chancellors from around Australia went to India together on a mass marketing exercise to attract more international students. One would have thought that the government had a very good understanding of how this global market actually works. In fact, the Education Minister demonstrates his knowledge quite well in his pitch to University Australia annual conference.
We now estimate that by the end of this year, it's likely that we'll be back to the same number of international students starting a degree as there was before the pandemic, starting a degree. That's good news because this is the biggest export that we don't dig out of the ground. But that's not good enough. On the current trajectory, the total number of international students enrolled in our universities won't get back to pre-pandemic levels until the end of 2025. It's a couple of years away. We can do more.
And of course, that "we can do more" strategy involved the Home Affairs Minister in coming up with a plan to offer longer graduate visas to certain international students.
Yesterday, I announced with Minister Claire O'Neill that from the 1st of July, international students who graduate with skills where we've got a critical shortage of those skills will be able to work in Australia for an extra 2 years. That means someone who gets a bachelor's degree will be able to work here for 4 years instead of 2. Someone who gains a PhD will be able to work here for 6 years instead of 4. Other countries have been eating our lunch. Some are already back to pre-pandemic levels. Some never dipped. Others are way in front. This, I hope, will attract more of the best and brightest to study here in Australia and help Australian businesses that I'm sure you know that are screaming out for more skilled workers.
Disgracefully, we know the government intends to renege on that promise on the 1st of July this year. Sadly, thousands of international students rushed to accept the longer 485 graduate visa offer by enrolling in those courses. In addition to this broken promise, the Education Minister told the group of 8 most influential universities in Australia that they need to diversify the nationalities of their intake. According to an article in the Sydney Morning Herald this week, it read, "Cut reliance on Chinese and Indian students, government tells universities." Why Chinese and Indian students have anything to do with the cause of the housing crisis is beyond most of us. I mean, after all, isn't there debate on reducing student numbers in general? So why do China and India get singled out? Does the government want to simply reduce Indians and Chinese nationals entering Australia? And if so, they should tell us clearly. Or is it that if the majority of students making up the increased student numbers came from the UK, Europe, or the US, then there would be no need to reduce these numbers? This is all rather disturbing, and I can see the comment sections filling up with calls that such a policy is racist. What makes it even more confusing is the Education Minister was telling the universities a very different story 12 months ago when boasting with joy of the number of Indian students arriving in Australia.
And it means that students are coming back, some faster than others. In the last year, there's been a 160% jump in the number of students coming to Australia from India. 160%. Think about that.
Yes, Jason, we are thinking about that, and the obvious contradiction. And then towards the end of a crazy week came Peter Dutton. And just when you thought crazy could not get crazier, he came out with his policy to reduce the permanent migration numbers by a further 25% without really explaining how that would work. You see, historically, 60% of the skilled migration program is filled by people already living and working in Australia, and they use the permanent visa programs to shift away from being temporary residents to permanent residents. Now some updates on the 485 graduate visa age cap rules set to start on the 1st of July. The petition I wrote has been approved this week and is now ready to sign. Please everyone, even if you're not directly affected, help out and e-sign it. It has over 1,400 signatures already, and I have not even promoted it. In the petition, I have requested a specific transition period to be given to those who have already begun their courses in Australia. And this is what I wrote. The proposed government laws, which will take effect on the 1st of July 2024, will exclude all international students studying in Australia who are over 35 from being able to apply for the Graduate 485 visa. This will cause serious financial and emotional harm to thousands of international students who are already in Australia studying, expecting they will have access to a working visa when they finish their studies. Many students have planned and counted on gaining this postgraduate working visa for varied reasons. For many, it is an essential requirement to gain their skill assessments for migration purposes. For others, who need Australian work experience to gain specific licenses, and for others who depend on gaining meaningful Australian work experience. This is not the right way to treat our international visitors who contribute significantly to our economy. These law changes will crush the dreams and hopes of the people we want to attract to Australia. It also creates a reputation for Australia that you cannot trust what the Australian government offers to international students. In particular, this law impacts highly talented PhD students, most of whom are over 35. I could have written a lot more, of course, but there is a limit to the number of words. I'll leave the link to this petition in the description of this video. And some good news this week from the Green political party. They agreed to support for the transitional call for the affected international students. Thanks to Subin, who forwarded an email to our office of a response he received from Senator Larissa Waters and Senator Nick McKinn's office. Subin and many others have been busy writing to every politician they can. You are all a great example of making a difference, so do not stop. Keep the pressure mounting. Part of the Greens' response was, the Albanese Labor government, like the Coalition, are using immigration to stoke fear and division amongst our communities. Preventing those over 35 years of age from applying for a visa is deeply prejudiced. Australia's Age Discrimination Act prohibits discrimination in employment on the basis of age, and the government should not employ different standards for our international graduates. Even more concerningly, the government has indicated it will make several significant changes without consideration for the adverse effects of current international students already studying in Australia at an Australian university. To leave these students in limbo is unacceptable. Everyone, we still have over a month to go, so now is the time not to give up hope. Keep contacting as many politicians and media outlets as you can and share your story with them. Over the years now, and more recently since the budget release, we have been getting so many questions about what's happening to the skilled independent 189 visa invitations. Sadly, it seems the 189 visa is slowly being deactivated. Once hailed as the technological masterpiece of migration selection process, questions now have to be asked whether this computer program will ever operate again as originally designed.
Stop there. I'm afraid. My mind is going.
Just like poor old Hal, many people fear what the future brings and their chances of receiving invitations. Since the government is saying nothing quite some time now, I decided to share what I think we can expect. Remember, this is just my opinion, but it's based on analysing the system since it was introduced in 2011. Back then, the Immigration Department boasted assessment of an EOI will be fully automatic and based solely on information provided in an online form, which means that documents are not required upon submission. It was meant to be the ultimate independent selection process to save us from meddling government ministers. The first in highest points candidates felt confident of their chances over everyone else there in their lower ranking. Before the pandemic swept the globe, those with a 90-point score had a reasonable chance of receiving an invitation. Invitations were as regular as clockwork. Everyone knew their place and what to expect, but not so anymore. During the pandemic, it switched to a subjective, human selection process based upon skill shortage imperatives and, to some degree, even political survival. The department dribbled out invitations, calling them boutique targeted rounds. Of course, there was nothing boutique about them. In fact, it was a slaughterhouse, and most occupations were essentially crushed of any hope. Gone too was any notion of when the next invitation rounds would occur. Given the recent planning levels of just 16,900 for the 24-25 financial year, just over half last year's quota, many of the occupations on the 189 list still may not receive invitations. We feel the government will use the pool of tens of thousands of EOIs floating out there in cyberspace and reserve to continue this targeted selection process. We also know the government is not happy with the current point system arrangement. If they had their way, the point system would be already dissected and remapped, but they have promised a community consultation process in its redevelopment, which of course will take time. It is likely then they will use the EOI pool to select people in occupations targeted in high demand, such as construction workers, teachers, and the usual medical-related occupation. Now that's nothing new there, but they may also focus on giving invitations not just on a points priority or on a first-in, first-served basis, but rather on higher English levels, work experience, partner skills, and younger ages. We know already these are the criteria the government has coveted in the migration strategy releases. Given the states and territories will soon be given healthy quotas once again, they will be free to choose occupations they need the most. We are fairly certain, though, that their state migration plans, currently on the drawing boards, will have some form of requirement for those in Australia to prove that they can work at their skill level in their nominated occupations or perhaps closely related. Those who are offshore and have significant work experience, say more than 5 years, but are still under 35 and with partners who are also skilled and perhaps good English, will be the most desired fish to catch. Now let's catch up on some of the news this week. Just before the budget, the Queensland Premier was out there pleading with the federal government to slow down on the number of migrants.
Stephen Miles has actually had something sensible to say. He's had a go at the federal government because he's so frustrated by the population growth. He says if migration continues at current levels, we'll need tens of thousands more homes every year, more than we can actually build. And he urges Canberra to consider moderating migration levels to assist with population.
So on this Thursday, when Migration Queensland released its newsletter, I had to laugh with the title that states, Introducing the Skilled Workforce Attraction Office, where it states, the SWAO will provide targeted assistance to support the Queensland Government and industry to advocate and coordinate for Queensland's interests with the federal government on this skilled migration program, etc., etc., etc. Basically, they were highlighting how they're going to attract people to Queensland and how they're going to keep them there. Just another example of government departments not really knowing what each one is doing. Aside from that amusing part, the newsletter did contain some interesting facts since the SMP program was closed on the 10th of May. Now the top 10 occupations in the SMP program turned out to be software engineer, mechanical engineer, accountant, chef, electrical engineer, resident medical officers, civil engineer, cafe or restaurant manager, motor mechanic, and ICT business analyst. They stated this year's program was highly competitive as Queensland received 40,000 EOIs for a nomination allocation of just 1,550 places. Wow, that is competitive indeed. And this financial year it should bring more quota for them. However, I have to wonder, we have the Premier saying that Queensland is full and there's not enough houses, but what is missing from the top 10 list? Not a single carpenter, tiler, or in fact any other trade which would help build these houses. I'm sure I'm not the only one thinking this does not really make sense. And of course the media has been full of the reaction to the migration numbers and plans released on budget night. If you missed that, I'll leave a link to our special budget edition we released on Wednesday night. Of course, we expected Peter Dutton to try and come up with something controversial because that's what opposition leaders are meant to do. Otherwise, they become irrelevant, like him. Come reality time, if they ever get back into power, things would be very different. And it's the end of a very busy week for me. 2 videos in 7 days is a cracking pace to keep up with. There will be so much happening in the next few months. Make sure you keep up to date by subscribing and hitting that notification bell. Thanks for all of your heartfelt comments. It really does keep me going. As always, take care out there and I'll see you next time. So bye for now.